They had orders to stop anyone crossing the front. Instead, they found someone carrying something no soldier could explain. She never carried a rifle. She never carried a flag. Yet battle-hardened men lowered their weapons the moment they saw what rested in her worn canvas bag. Why would American checkpoints quietly wave a young German woman through while everyone else was searched? What could be so important that officers risked breaking protocol without saying a word? And why, years later, would one decorated captain insist that the bravest person he had ever met had never worn a uniform? The answers were hidden inside a journey that almost disappeared from history. By the winter of 1945, the front had become less a straight line than a wound stretching across frozen villages and abandoned roads. Captain Thomas Walker had spent months learning that every stranger could carry danger, every unexpected movement demanded caution, and every decision could change someone's fate. That cold morning, a sentry pointed toward a narrow country road where a lone figure walked through drifting snow with calm, measured steps. She wore a faded gray wool coat patched at the elbows, sturdy leather boots stained by mud, and a scarf pulled tightly against the wind. Slung over one shoulder was a weathered canvas satchel that looked far too light to hold supplies, yet far too carefully protected to be ordinary. She did not hurry, she did not hesitate. Even as armed soldiers stepped into her path, her eyes remained steady, as though she had crossed this invisible line many times before and expected only one thing, not kindness, not mercy, but the chance to keep walking. Captain Thomas Walker raised one gloved hand, and the two military police soldiers beside him stopped the young woman before she reached the frozen crossroads. She neither stepped back nor looked for another path. Instead, she quietly shifted the canvas satchel from one shoulder to the other, protecting it from the wind more carefully than she protected herself. Thomas noticed that small movement before anything else. Experienced officers learned to read habits long before words. People guarded what mattered most. "Open the bag," he said evenly. She nodded without protest and knelt in the snow, brushing away a thin layer of ice before placing the satchel on the ground. Inside were no coded maps, no military papers, and no hidden weapon. There were neatly folded bandages, 2 loaves of dark bread wrapped in linen, small glass bottles of medicine cushioned with wool, several handwritten letters tied together with blue string, and a weathered notebook filled with names. Thomas frowned. The pages listed families, children, elderly couples, and villages, each line marked with careful pencil notes beside them. Some simply read safe, others read waiting. He looked up at the young woman. "Who are these people?" She met his eyes with surprising calm. "People who still believe someone is coming," she answered softly. The words lingered in the cold air far longer than the sound of her voice, and for the first time that winter morning, Thomas found himself questioning not the woman before him, but the assumptions he had carried through the war. Thomas looked back at the notebook, turning each page more slowly than the last. Every name carried a destination. Every destination carried a date. Some entries had tiny check marks beside them, while others remained blank, waiting. There was no military pattern, no hidden code that he could recognize. It looked less like intelligence and more like a promise that someone refused to abandon. "Who gave you these names?" he asked. The young woman closed the satchel carefully before answering. "Mothers, fathers, children, sometimes a neighbor, sometimes a stranger." Her voice remained steady, almost gentle. When people lose everything, they still ask the same question. They want to know if someone they love is alive. A cold wind swept across the empty road, carrying loose snow over their boots. One of the military police soldiers shifted uneasily, glancing toward Thomas for instructions. The captain remained silent. He remembered similar questions from American families waiting for telegrams back home. Different language, different uniforms, the same quiet fear. "What is your name?" he finally asked. "Anna Keller," she answered without hesitation. "And every week you cross the front with this bag?" She nodded once. "As often as the roads stay open." Thomas studied her face. There was no pride, no plea for sympathy, only a calm determination that seemed strangely untouched by exhaustion. He realized she had not asked for permission, forgiveness, or protection. She had asked for nothing at all. Somehow, that unsettled him more than any explanation could. Thomas closed the notebook and slipped it back into the canvas satchel himself, taking care not to bend a single page. He stood quietly for a moment, then looked toward the narrow road disappearing between frost-covered trees. "I am coming with you," he said. The two military police soldiers exchanged puzzled glances, but neither questioned the order. Anna simply adjusted the strap over her shoulder and began walking. She did not thank him. She only continued at the same steady pace, as though every minute already belonged to someone waiting farther ahead. The road wound through silent fields where abandoned wagons rested beneath fresh snow, and smoke drifted lazily from a handful of chimneys that had somehow survived another winter. Nearly an hour later, they reached a small stone church standing alone above a frozen creek. There were no soldiers waiting there, only civilians wrapped in patched coats, their faces worn by months of uncertainty. An elderly woman stepped forward the moment she recognized Anna. Her trembling hands accepted one of the blue-tied letters before pressing it against her chest without opening it. Tears filled her eyes long before she unfolded the paper. Nearby, a young boy smiled as Anna handed him a small loaf of bread and gently checked the bandage around his wrist. No speeches were exchanged. No dramatic reunions unfolded. There were only quiet nods, grateful hands, and the unmistakable feeling that, for a few precious minutes, fear had stepped aside to make room for hope. Thomas had expected one village. Instead, there was another, then another beyond the next ridge. By late afternoon, the canvas satchel felt lighter, but Anna never seemed relieved. Each stop simply revealed another name waiting inside the weathered notebook. At a small farmhouse with broken shutters, she left a bottle of medicine for an old man whose breathing had grown shallow through the winter. At a converted schoolhouse, she delivered 3 folded letters to children who gathered around a cast-iron stove, reading familiar handwriting as though hearing distant voices carried home by the wind. Thomas noticed something else. Every person greeted Anna differently, yet all reacted the same way. Their shoulders relaxed, their eyes softened, the room became quieter the moment she entered. Hope, he realized, did not always arrive with supplies. Sometimes it arrived with certainty. As the afternoon faded into pale gold, they reached a wooden bridge where 2 American engineers paused their repair work to let them cross. One of the men recognized Thomas and raised an eyebrow, silently asking why a German civilian walked beside an American captain without restraints. Thomas answered with nothing more than a small nod. The engineer stepped aside without another question. Anna continued forward, never noticing the quiet decision that had just been made behind her. For the first time in many months, Thomas found himself measuring success not by territory gained, but by the number of people who smiled before the day was over. Over the next several days, the journey settled into a rhythm that no military schedule could have predicted. At every checkpoint, Thomas expected questions. Instead, word seemed to travel ahead of them without letters, radios, or official reports. A guard would glance at the familiar canvas satchel, then at the quiet young woman beside it, and step aside with little more than a respectful nod. No orders had been written. No regulations had changed, yet something invisible was spreading from post to post. At one supply station, an American medic quietly added fresh bandages to the satchel without writing them into inventory. At another, a field cook wrapped warm bread in clean cloth and handed it to Anna before she could ask. No one spoke about kindness. They simply practiced it. Thomas watched these small exchanges with growing amazement. The war had taught everyone to measure people by uniforms, accents, and borders. Anna measured them by entirely different questions. Who was hungry? Who was waiting? Who had not heard from family? As the notebook slowly filled with fresh pencil marks beside old names, Thomas realized he was witnessing something no battle map could record. Roads remained damaged. Bridges remained fragile. The winter remained bitterly cold. Yet wherever Anna stopped, strangers began helping strangers. Hope, he discovered, moved quietly from one ordinary person to another, asking for nothing except the courage to continue its journey. On the 7th morning, the wind carried an unfamiliar silence across the valley. Even before they reached the next village, Thomas sensed that something had changed. The road ahead was crowded with families standing beside handcarts and worn suitcases, waiting patiently before a narrow wooden bridge that had been closed after heavy ice weakened its supports. No one argued, no one pushed forward, they simply waited, uncertain whether they would ever cross. Anna stopped without saying a word. She opened the canvas satchel and looked inside. Only a few bandages remained. 1 loaf of bread, 2 bottles of medicine. She could not help everyone. Thomas watched her face carefully, expecting hesitation. It never came. She walked straight toward a young mother holding an infant wrapped beneath an oversized wool blanket. The child shivered despite the layers. Anna draped her own scarf around the baby before placing the last loaf of bread into the mother's hands. Next, she knelt beside an elderly man whose fingers had grown stiff from the cold, gently wrapping fresh bandages around cracked skin before offering him the final bottle of medicine. By the time she closed the satchel, it was almost empty. Yet the line of waiting people no longer looked defeated. An American engineer quietly crossed the bridge carrying blankets. Another followed with hot coffee. Without orders, without speeches, without anyone announcing it, compassion had become contagious. Thomas realized the satchel had never been the true weight she carried. The real burden had always been reminding ordinary people that kindness was still a choice, even in the hardest winter. That evening, Thomas returned to headquarters carrying the nearly empty canvas satchel in one hand and the weathered notebook in the other. His commanding officer studied the worn pages without speaking, pausing at the hundreds of names written in careful pencil. "Who authorized this?" he finally asked. Thomas answered with complete honesty. "No one did." The room fell silent. Military procedures depended on signatures, permissions, and official routes. Anna's journey had followed none of them, yet somehow it had accomplished what formal systems could not. The colonel closed the notebook and looked through the frosted window for a long moment before reaching into his desk drawer. He removed a blank travel document normally reserved for essential civilian movement and signed it with slow, deliberate strokes. "This is highly unusual, Captain," he said quietly. "Do not make me regret it." Thomas accepted the paper with a simple nod. Outside, he found Anna waiting exactly where he had left her, standing beneath a bare oak tree while light snow settled across her shoulders. He handed her the folded document. She read it once, then looked up with quiet surprise. "This will let you pass every American checkpoint," Thomas said. Anna carefully placed the paper inside the notebook instead of her coat pocket, as though it belonged with every other promise she carried. She offered only 2 words, "Thank you." Thomas shook his head gently. "Do not thank me," he replied. "Just keep walking." For the first time since the war had reached those frozen roads, following the rules and doing the right thing no longer felt like the same decision. The winter finally loosened its grip, and with the changing season the roads slowly filled with ordinary life again. Wagons returned. Church bells rang once more. Children who had spent months whispering learned how to laugh out loud. Anna continued walking long after headlines had shifted and armies had moved on. The notebook grew thicker with new names, while old ones were gently crossed out, not because they had been forgotten, but because families had found one another again. Captain Thomas Walker returned home to Oklahoma later that year. Friends often asked him about medals, campaigns, and victories. He rarely spoke of them. Instead, he kept one small photograph inside his desk drawer. It showed a worn canvas satchel resting on a wooden chair beside a weathered notebook tied with blue string. Decades later, when his grandson asked who the owner had been, Thomas smiled quietly before answering. She reminded people who they were when fear tried to make them someone else. No monument was ever built along those frozen roads. No history book devoted chapters to a young woman who carried letters, bread, and medicine across forgotten villages. Yet the lives she touched continued telling her story in kitchens, churches, and family tables for generations. Sometimes courage does not arrive with commands. Sometimes it walks quietly from door to door, asking for nothing, expecting nothing, and leaving behind something stronger than victory itself. Because the quiet ones are never truly ordinary. They simply raise the standard without ever raising their voices.